All right. Welcome, everyone, to National Park Service Presents. This is season 3. I'm so excited. It's just getting bigger and better every year. And this is an entirely online series that runs every other Wednesday at 6 p.m. until about the end of April. I believe this year we're going to April 26th. It covers an amazing multitude of topics. But before we get into today's, I'm going to go over a few of the boring Zoom features that you've heard me go on and on about for 2 years, but you just got to do it. So, letting everyone know now, you can tell your friends, we are recording. All right, so we are recording these. You can catch up on today's or the rest of the series, or even past years from last year on the Boston Public Library's YouTube page. I will drop that in the chat in a moment. But yes, we are recording. If you do not like the captions that you are seeing, feel free to hit the CC button in the navigation bar below and you can turn them off. Another thing in the navigation bar that we have is the chat button. This is a very rare place that we keep the chat open with this many wonderful friends on the webinar. And that's because all of you are amazing. You can ask any question you want in there. All we ask is for you to be respectful, but don't be shy. Feel free, ask away. When you do that, be sure you notice the to form though, because Zoom will do 2 things. You will either send it to the hosted panelists, meaning everyone you will see on today's screen, or you'll show it to everyone, meaning everyone back home today, plus the people you see on the screen. So just be aware, because sometimes people don't want everyone to know their questions. At the very end, your questions will be asked more towards the end, so we don't interrupt the flow of the program. And at the very, very, very end, there will be a survey that pops up. And if you could take that, that would be great. So I think that's the quickest I have ever done this. And honestly, there wasn't too much babbling, so go me. But without further ado, please welcome Rangers Ryan, Megan, and Sean as they present Boston and Underground Railroad Hub.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Karen. Thank you to our friends at BPL for hosting us again. And to all of you that joined us, last count we had was over 300 people. So that's just really amazing. I don't know if they've all shown up, but we'll get those numbers later. It shows you the interest in this subject, and it's something that's certainly interests us. We've been working on this project, Boston Underground Railroad Hub, which is a digital exhibition for the past 3 years. And we're happy to share some of the features of that with you here tonight. But first off, National Parks of Boston, in case you're new to that term or new to this series, if you haven't heard that expression before, National Parks of Boston is really 3 separate legislated parks. It's Boston National Historical Park, who you might know more as the rangers you see out on the Freedom Trail, working with our partners along that trail at Faneuil Hall, at Charlestown Navy Yard, Bunker Hill Monument. It's also Boston Harbor Islands State and National Parks out on the harbor. And we are also Boston African American National Historic Site, which is the place I spent the bulk of my career, which is over on Beacon Hill with our partners, the Museum of African American History. There's a lot of themes and threads that connect to all 3 of those parks, stories of revolution, stories of resistance, stories of how people use their voice, how change is made. But one of the other historic themes that runs through all 3 parks is the Underground Railroad. So that was really one of the cool things about this project, is that we could really get into all 3 parks with this digital exploration. I'm going to take about 10 minutes or so to give sort of a brief picture, big picture overview of the Underground Railroad in Boston. And then I'm going to hand it over to 2 of my colleagues and really good friends that are going to dive into specific features and stories that are highlighted in this exhibit. All right, so what is the Underground Railroad? It's certainly one of the most significant and early and longest running aspects of the centuries-long civil rights struggle in this country. It's also one of the most mythologized, maybe even misunderstood movements in U.S. history. When I was doing tours of the Black Heritage Trail, just a few years back, people still had notions of secret tunnels from the south to the north, or hidden rooms and stuff like that. And of course, some of that stuff probably probably happened, but the reality of the Underground Railroad is a lot more interesting when you dive into these individual stories. And that's what we try to get into here with this project. I think the most straightforward of the definitions of the Underground Railroad comes from our colleagues at the Network to Freedom program. It's a National Park Service national program, and it's essentially a national registry of all sites that are affiliated with the Underground Railroad. And Sean, if you can drop that link in there to the Network to Freedom, you may have already done that. But this is what they say. The Underground Railroad, the resistance to enslavement through escape and flight through the end of the Civil War, refers to the efforts of enslaved African Americans to gain their freedom by escaping bondage. And I like that because it puts the focus where it should be. It's on the individual enslaved person that makes that very difficult decision to leave that, where they are, to, success wasn't guaranteed in running away, and to really leave everything behind and take that step towards freedom. And that's captured, I think, in probably the most famous freedom seeker in our country's history. Megan, if you want to go to the next slide. Frederick Douglass, who of course had his birthday yesterday, he wrote about that sort of that feeling. He said, "No man can tell the intense agony which is felt by the slave when wavering on the point of making his escape. All that he has is at stake, and even that which he has not. The life which he has may be lost, and the liberty which he seeks may not be gained." So it really focuses on the individual, and several of the features on our project that Megan and Sean will get into focus specifically on the individual freedom seekers. And while many freedom seekers began their journey unaided, some even finished their journey unaided. In each decade, as we got closer to the Civil War, there was more of this public awareness and more knowledge of a secretive Underground Railroad network. And in some cases, like here in Boston, not so secretive Underground Railroad network. So another, helpful definition of the Underground Railroad comes from the historian Eric Foner, who wrote a great book a couple of years back called Gateway to Freedom about the Underground Railroad network in New York City. What he said is the Underground Railroad should be understood not as a single entity, but as an umbrella term for local groups that employed numerous methods to assist fugitives, some public and entirely legal, and some flagrant violations of the law. And so what we're going to do today is show you, both those sides of the story, the individual freedom seekers along with the local individuals and local groups that were here to assist. So why Boston? Why was Boston such a hotbed of Underground Railroad activity? There were a couple of reasons for sure. Certainly one of the number one reasons is that Massachusetts is among the first states to end slavery. We're talking 1783, the High Court of Massachusetts ruled slavery unconstitutional. 1790, the first federal census, we're the only state in the Union not to record any slaves on the census. And so Boston was a free city in a free state. And even though there was an early 1793 fugitive slave law on the books, I haven't found too much evidence of that actually being enforced up here. So if you could make it to Massachusetts, at least in those early days, it seemed like it was a good thing. So now, coupled with that, if we want to go to the next slide, Megan, being a free state, there was a free Black community throughout the state, concentrated in places like New Bedford, Salem, but the largest Black community was here in Boston, for the most part living on the north slope of Beacon Hill and into the West End. And this is the community that really turned their neighborhood into a sanctuary for those running away from slavery. Next slide, please. Another huge reason why the Underground Railroad was so big here in Boston was our harbor. We had a very busy, a very active harbor. And while many people's notions of the Underground Railroad are people running through the woods following the North Star, people escaping on foot or in carriages, you can't underestimate the importance of the waterways when it came to running away. Sometimes it was the quickest route, particularly for those folks on the eastern seaboard. The fastest way from Virginia to the north is via boat. So you have people either finding sympathetic captains or crew members aboard these ships bound for the north, sometimes paying them, or also sometimes just sneaking on as stowaways and hiding out as those boats left southern ports and made their way to Boston. And then, once folks landed in this, arrived in the harbor, there were often welcoming committees, Black women that would go out to sell fruit and other things to the sailors on boats. And they acted as important liaisons between those that were hiding out on the boats and getting crucial information to them and telling folks back in the city that there were folks on board that needed help. So the waterways were huge. If we can go to our next slide. The other thing that Boston had a number of very important community organizations that were dedicated to fugitive assistance. So, we see this in the churches, particularly the Black churches, but also in organizations such as the New England Freedom Association. It was a Black organization, and if you want to, you can actually read their mission statement right there that was printed in the Liberator. It said that the object of our association is to extend a helping hand to all who may bid adieu to whips and chains, and by the welcome light of the North Star, reach a haven where they can be protected from the grasp of the man-stealer. So this group not only met publicly in places such as the African Meeting House, they raised food, money, clothing, information for folks that were coming to Boston and seeking freedom here in the city, either to land here forever or as they were passing through to get further north. There were also 3 iterations of another organization called the Boston Vigilance Committee. This was an interracial alliance. There's one in the early 1840s, one in the mid 1840s, and the largest and certainly most active Boston Vigilance Committee grew up in response to the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. So we'll go to our next slide there, please. If you're unfamiliar with this law, it's part of a larger package of legislation passed by Congress called the Compromise of 1850, with concessions to the North, concessions to the South. But this fugitive slave law was just this horrific law that made it a federal crime to run away from slavery, to help anybody run away from slavery. So if you were caught sheltering or assisting a freedom seeker in any way, it was 6 months in prison, $1,000 fine. Slave owners had the right to send slave catchers north looking for you. These folks were often United States Marshals, so you had the federal government tracking people down on the streets of Boston and elsewhere in the north looking for freedom seekers. And that law also mandated the compliance of state and local officials, even in the free states. So police officers here in the city could be tapped to help arrest freedom seekers, judges, the governor, everybody was involved, and the public was mandated to assist as well. Again, all under the threat of that 6 months in prison, $1,000 fine if you didn't assist. But despite that law, the Vigilance Committee, put a lot of resources, a lot of money, and a lot of organization to helping folks that came to Boston on the Underground Railroad. And fortunately for us, if we go to our next slide, the Vigilance Committee kept meticulous records of where all their money went. So this is like the treasure trove for Underground Railroad folks here, one of the treasure troves for Underground Railroad historians in the city. You can see in page after page of their account book, we just read down here, it says, John Taylor, who ran a boarding house over on Beacon Hill, is reimbursed for boarding Henry Long and Jones. It's reimbursed $10, and this is in November of 1850. Susan Burroughs for Joseph Truitt and wife and 2 children. And then we see, our most famous Underground Railroad leader here in Boston, Lewis Hayden, boarding fugitives John Simmons, William Miller, Jason Jackson, Solomon Banks, George Reason, Isaac Mason and wife. I mean, we've got names of the folks that ran away to Boston listed here and the folks that were sheltering them here in Boston. So that page after page of this Vigilance Committee account book, I mean, every one of these sentences, if we had the resources, could be another biography of people on the Underground Railroad. That does get us to Lewis Hayden, though. If we go to our next stop, without question, Lewis and Harriet Hayden, that's their home over there on Beacon Hill. If you want to go to the next slide, we can actually see who I'm talking about here. These two were, preeminent leaders in Boston's Underground Railroad, and they were formerly enslaved themselves. They had escaped on the Underground Railroad, made their way eventually to the safety of Canada, but they said our fight's back here in the States, and they moved to Beacon Hill and opened their home as like the, most well-documented safe house in the area. And some of the famous people that they helped shelter, if we want to go to our next slide, is Ellen and William Craft, this amazing enslaved couple that escaped through an ingenious disguise. That's Ellen with the top hat. She was very light-skinned to the point where she could pass herself as white, and so she dressed up as a white male slave master, pretended her husband was her slave, and in disguise actually took a regular train and then eventually a boat to Boston. And they lived with the Haydens for a number of months. And the slave, the Haydens and the Crafts knew the slave catchers would be looking for them. And so what William Craft reflected a few years later was, he said, right out of his mouth, he said, Lewis Hayden and I had a keg of gunpowder under his house on Phillip Street in Beacon Hill, with a fuse attached, ready to light it should any attempt be made to capture us. So these guys knew that the slave catchers were coming and they were going to be ready. Hayden had armed guards at all hours of the day at his house to protect those folks that he was sheltering there. And in a stinging defeat, the slave catchers did come to Boston looking for the Crafts, but the abolitionists thwarted their way at every turn and got it to the point where they actually left the city without actually capturing them. The Crafts made their way to England. So real heroic stories happening here in the streets of the city. Why don't we go to our next slide? Hayden is also involved in the case of Shadrach Minkins, and this is actually the anniversary of this case. February 15th, 1851, Shadrach Minkins, who had fled via boat from Norfolk, Virginia, made his way to Boston. He was captured at a coffee shop where he was working here in downtown Boston, and he was brought to the courthouse where the judge was going to, of course, send him back south to slavery. But word spread quickly of his arrest. It got back to Hayden, and he was able to organize a posse of roughly 50 people. And in broad daylight, these folks stormed the courthouse and literally rescued Shadrach from the hands of the slave catchers. It all happened so quick. No, pursuit was really, after Shadrach and the rescuers took place. Shadrach hid out in Beacon Hill for the rest of the day, and then later that night, early the next morning, he was taken to Concord, and about 4 or 5 days later was free up in Montreal, where he lived the rest of his life. One of the ministers back then said the rescue of Shadrach today was the most noble deed done in Boston since they destroyed the tea back in 1773. So these guys actually, really viewed themselves as that, that second iteration, that second coming of the American Revolution. Let's go to our next slide. Hayden's also involved in Boston's most notorious fugitive slave case. Anthony Burns was 20 years old, again from Virginia, snuck out on a boat as it's made its way to the harbor, got a job here in the city. He was arrested under false charges and was going to be sent back to slavery. Hayden and others again attempted a courthouse rescue, and in the melee that ensued at the Boston courthouse, one of the deputy slave catchers was killed. To his dying day, Hayden felt it was his bullet that killed the slave catchers, but there were a lot of people that claimed to be the one person that killed the slave catcher. But as a result of that, they weren't able to rescue Burns, and the federal government sent in several thousand soldiers and put the whole city on martial lockdown for several days until Burns was paraded down State Street, and that's his parade. As he's being brought to the harbor front to be put on a boat to go back down south. Now, the happy ending of the Burns story, we want to go to our next slide. Leonard Grimes, the minister of the 12th Baptist Church, which was also known as the Fugitive Slaves Church, he was able to raise $1,300, and about 9 months later, go down south himself and negotiate the purchase of Anthony Burns's freedom. And Burns was freed and eventually went to Oberlin College, and there's a picture of him there with his graduating class, and became a minister for the remainder of his unfortunately short life. He died at, I think, 28 years old. And the other, if you say there's good things that come out of these bad cases, is that Burns case gave abolitionists the political capital to stage a massive statewide petition drive to pass a Personal Liberties Act, which happened. And that Personal Liberties Act essentially made it impossible. It was a state law trying to override federal law. It made it essentially impossible to return another freedom seeker from Massachusetts back to slavery. And in fact, Burns I know he was the last public fugitive slave taken back from Massachusetts, and I think maybe possibly even the whole North. So 1854 was that Burns case. So those are a couple of big picture highlights of what was going on. I tried to cover 60 years in about 10 minutes here. I hope I didn't talk too fast, but those are some of the stories we dived into with this digital exploration called Boston and Underground Railroad Hub. It is on our website. It started off as part of our response to the pandemic when the site closed down and people couldn't physically visit. We tried to find ways of engaging people virtually and helping the students and the teachers that were asking for some of this information as well. So it started off pretty modest. There was a handful of story maps that looked at individual freedom seekers, as well as a larger mapping feature that Megan's going to talk about to show that big picture of the Underground Railroad here in Boston. And over the years, we've kept adding to it. There's a lot of features on there now. There's films, there is lots of articles. For example, last year when we rededicated the 54th Massachusetts Memorial, we have an article now that talks about the Underground Railroad connections with that regiment and the building of the monument. And more recently, if we go to our next slide, that's our main page of the hub. Let's go to the next one. We've been working on a Boston Vigilance Committee project where we're trying to write mini biographies of all 200 plus members of the Boston Vigilance Committee. So who were these people that were contributing their talent, their money, their resources to helping folks here in the city? We've got about 40 or so of the 200 plus that are members of that 1850 Boston Vigilance Committee. And we'll be learning a little more about some of our other new features when we get to Sean in a bit. But for now, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Megan, who's going to be diving into some of these Underground Railroad maps. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Ryan. So I'm going to take a minute and just take us over to our webpage for Boston Underground Railroad Hub, and I'll be returning to the PowerPoint in just a few minutes. But I wanted to show that this is the homepage for this digital exhibition. And one of the main aspects of this hub is, like what Ryan mentioned, mapping the Underground Railroad. So if you scroll down, we have mapping the Underground Railroad right here. And now if we open this page, you'll be taken to a digital map. This digital map shows people, places, organizations connected to the Underground Railroad network in Boston. And you'll also notice that we have a couple historical maps in the background, and I'd like to actually shout out the Boston Public Library, specifically the Norman Leventhal Map Center. They have thousands of maps in their collection, and so we were able to use a couple from their collection. We have this Greater Boston, Massachusetts map, and then also a City of Boston map, and they're both from the 1850s. And while this map features notable safe houses and operatives, it also highlights different sites of protests, historic rescues, arrests, and renditions, as well as concerted action against the fugitive slave law. And by identifying all these different people and places on a map, we can broaden the stories that we share on the Underground Railroad to include both the recognizable stories, that some of which that Ryan shared, and also some of the little known stories. So now if you look at this map, you can really see how the Underground Railroad spanned across Boston. You can also see even a couple points for the Boston Harbor Islands, kind of mentioning, recognizing the Maritime Underground Railroad that Ryan just spoke about. And we can see that there's a couple clusters. So as you zoom in, those clusters divide into smaller clusters and individual points. So now if you scroll in and say we select a point, you'll see a little pop-up box. And each of those pop-up boxes has a little bit of a description about the person or place that it recognizes, as well as an image. So if it's a person, it'll be a portrait of them or a place. And in a few cases, the places are still standing today, but in many of them, we've tried to identify the approximate location of the site, because the city of Boston has changed over time, so we can't be exact with some of these locations. So we tried to use historical maps to approximate their location. Now, if you were to click on this More button, it would take you to a separate page to learn a little bit more about the place or the person or the group that it recognizes. And primary source research is really at the heart of this map, and it's what helps us fill this map. We've pulled names, places, and events from a variety of different sources to help create this map. For example, we've used that account book that Ryan mentioned from the Boston Vigilance Committee. We've also looked at local newspapers and abolitionist newspapers like The Liberator. We've looked at accounts written by or about different individuals who are involved in Boston's Underground Railroad network, as well as a variety of other sources. And for each of these people and places that we include on this map, the amount of information related to them varies. In some cases, we've been able to locate quite a bit of information about them. And in others, we can only find a few newspaper articles here and there or just snippets of information. And especially during the pandemic, as Ryan said, we've been working on this project for about 3 years. We've largely had to rely upon sources that can be found online, which has narrowed down our research, our reach a little bit. Nevertheless, through this research, as you can see from this map, we've really been able to include a wide variety of stories connected to the Underground Railroad that truly spans Boston. And so now with that, just that quick overview of the map, I'm actually going to take us back to the PowerPoint, so then I can show a couple of the people and places that we highlight on this map. So the first person I wanted to recognize was Clara Vaught. And Clara Vaught's early life, we really don't know much about her. It's still a little bit unclear. We do know that she was born in Wilmington, North Carolina, and we suspect that she was born enslaved and escaped to freedom sometime before 1852. 1852 is really the first record we have of her in Boston. And while there is this gap in her story, we know that she played a considerable role in the Boston Vigilance Committee. So in the account book of Francis Jackson, the treasurer of the Boston Vigilance Committee, we can see that there are several mentions of Clara Vaught throughout the record book. And you can see one example over here to the right. She's mentioned in 1852, 1855, 56, and 59. And in this selection, you can see she's mentioned a couple times on this page, and specifically if you look down below, she is listed here for boarding James Gaston from Wilmington, North Carolina, which is really interesting since Wilmington, North Carolina, it raises the question as to whether she may have known this person or if she just felt that connection with them. We also know from Boston Vigilance Committee records that she boarded a George Mapson in 1855. We were able to conduct a little bit more research into this story, and we found an 1855 Massachusetts census record. And from this census record, we can see that George Mapson is listed living with Clara Vaught, and it also says that he was 10 years old at the time. We have Eliza Cecil, who's also living with Clara Vaught, and we don't know whether or not Eliza was also a freedom seeker, but clearly Clara Vaught was helping Eliza as well. While we know that Clara Vaught actively participated in the Underground Railroad in Boston through this research, we have limited information about Vaught's later years. The only information we do have has come from city directories and census records, which largely just reflect where she was living at the time or her occupation. And in one case in 1850, she was working in a, quote, intelligence office. And we have faced similar challenges in uncovering the stories of others involved in the Underground Railroad in Boston, particularly women. Now, the account book for the Vigilance Committee is one source that helps us shed a little bit more light on women's contributions to the Underground Railroad. And one of our colleagues has really been behind this research and elevating these stories of Clara Vaught and other women of the Underground Railroad in Boston. And she even created a video series about some of these women, which you can find on our digital hub. And now the next site I would like to highlight is one that highlights and demonstrates how a freedom seeker who had received help from Boston abolitionists later paid it forward by providing assistance to other freedom seekers through the Boston Vigilance Committee. So here we are at the site of Jane and Lawrence Woodfolk's Revere Court residence. This is one of those instances where the site has changed since 1850, so we include a picture of the approximate location of where their home would have likely been. Now, before I explain the importance of this particular site, let me briefly just share the story of Jane Woodfolk, formerly known as Jane Johnson. Now, Jane Johnson escaped from slavery in 1855 with her 2 sons. The 3 of them had traveled from DC to Philadelphia with their enslaver. And here, Jane Johnson resourcefully contacted local abolitionists. Now, these abolitionists escorted Johnson and her sons away from their enslaver, and that scene is depicted here in this engraving. These Philadelphia abolitionists then helped Jane and her sons make their way north to Boston, where they received help from Boston abolitionists. There are Vigilance Committee records that show that here in 1855, November 10th, William Mannix boarded Jane Johnson and 2 children, as well as helped provide shoes and other expenses. And then a couple lines later, we can see that Robert F. Walcott helped provide furniture for Jane Johnson. And Robert Walcott was actually the general agent of William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist paper, The Liberator. Now, while Johnson received this support in Boston, meanwhile in Philadelphia, the accomplices of Johnson and her son's escape were arrested and put on trial. During the trial, Johnson bravely returned to Philadelphia to testify against her enslaver before returning to Boston. Now, the place that we have included on our map really highlights Johnson's life in freedom when she became an active member of the Beacon Hill Black community. Jane Johnson married Lawrence Woodfolk and settled in Beacon Hill and lived at several places in Beacon Hill, such as this one. And here we can see from a Boston Vigilance Committee record that she boarded George Thompson and Henry Wilson from Richmond, Virginia. So she paid it forward and helped others on their path to freedom. Now, while this site only recognizes this small aspect of Jane Johnson's life, I do encourage you to explore our story map to learn more about Jane Johnson's powerful life story, so you can learn a little bit more about her. Now, next, I wanted to share a couple locations included on our map that really embody the reaction of Boston abolitionists to the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law and their efforts to thwart slave catchers who came to Boston. And so the first is the Boston Courthouse, which is a site of protests where we see a clash between activists and authorities. The courthouse played a significant role in several Underground Railroad stories, which Ryan has mentioned. It was here where Lewis Hayden and other Black abolitionists successfully rescued the freedom seeker Shadrach Minkins. Shortly afterwards, slave catchers held Thomas Sims here, and abolitionists planned to help him escape, but these plans were thwarted. And lastly, this is also where Hayden and other abolitionists attempted to rescue Anthony Burns, but he was returned to slavery. Now, in this case as well, the original building no longer stands today. So for this site, we do have a picture of the building that is there. However, there are a few striking sketches that we found in resources about these cases that include the courthouse, and one we have over here to the right. Now, this sketch depicts the courthouse in chains, so it's right here along the bottom of the columns. You can see chains along those columns, and these chains were put up to prevent an attempt to free Thomas Sims. Now, while the courthouse was a site of action, the last point that I want to highlight is that of the Boston Anti-Manhunting League, which formed after the rendition of Anthony Burns. We have a few points on this map that are related to different groups and organizations connected to the Underground Railroad. Now, these groups and organizations have either stated that one of their goals was to directly assist freedom seekers, or many members of the group or organization were active in the Underground Railroad. Now, in the case of the Anti-Manhunting League, they had both. Abolitionist leaders such as Austin Bierce, Samuel Gridley Howe, and Lewis Hayden were all members of this group. And one of the founders, Henry Bowditch, stated the League committed itself to, quote, entrap and kidnap, if you wish to use the word, the slaveholder. Henry Bowditch saved writings about the group, which his son later included in a book of his writings. And Bowditch wrote about the secretive nature of the group, how they used coded language in their record books, and how they planned and practiced their tactics. The Massachusetts Historical Society has the record book of the League, and so on the left, you can actually see a page from this record book, and note that there are some numbers listed throughout this page as they use numbers instead of names to help with the secrecy of this group. Now, over to the right is a diagram on how they plan to kidnap a slave catcher. So the SH in the middle refers to the slave handler, And then they would be encircled by two groups, two rings. The first would be a group of who would grab the arms and feet and head of the slave handler. Now this outer group would encircle the smaller group and pretend like they were helping the slave handler, but really help the smaller group move the slave handler into a carriage that would then take the slave handler away. Now, while the Boston Anti-Manhunting League never employed these tactics, we are able to recognize their agency, the agency of its members, thanks in part to its founder, Henry Bowditch. I also want to note that one aspect of this point is that there are actually two other points at that same site. So it's a part of a little cluster of points. And we also recognize Henry Bowditch. We have a little bio for him, as well as his home, which was where the 1846 Boston Vigilance Committee first met. So we do have some areas where there are multiple points at one site to recognize different people who are affiliated with it. Now, I hope these 4 sites really help show the variety of points and stories you will come across on the Underground Railroad map of Boston. And again, to help show how these efforts truly spanned the city of Boston. And there are many more incredible people, places, and organizations and events that these points highlight. So we really encourage you to take the time to explore this map. And we also continue to add to this map. As Ryan mentioned, we're doing a lot of research on the Boston Vigilance Committee. So whenever possible, we're trying to connect them to a location to show, to help build this map and show their agency at different areas in Boston. And with that, I will hand it over to Sean, who's actually going to share another story of a freedom seeker, as well as another feature of the Boston Underground Railroad Hub.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. So if you could take me to the next slide, please. So, one of the things that we really wanted to emphasize when doing this research and this work is not only the work of abolitionists in Boston, but also as much as possible to tell the stories of those people who were actually making the escape from enslavement, telling the stories of the freedom seekers themselves when we can. And one of the ways that we did this was through a story map feature, where we could pinpoint various locations throughout the country that these individuals may have been enslaved, may have escaped, and trace their journeys, explore their lives, and try our best to highlight, the bravery and the agency of those making the escape. But what I want to do here is not only tell the story of Elizabeth Blakely, who, I think is such a powerful and inspiring story, but also speak a little bit to process and kind of how we went about trying to uncover some of these stories. Because, as Ryan mentioned and Megan has talked about, the Underground Railroad, it was an illegal activity, and documenting that, talking about it, people very well could have been imprisoned. Their freedom was at stake, those escaping and those assisting freedom seekers. So in particular, looking at this story of Elizabeth Blakely, the first time I ever came across her story is actually from this narrative. Now, it's a narrative written by Austin Bierce. Ryan showed an image actually from this narrative earlier, talking about, maritime escapes on the Underground Railroad. And it's written in the 1880s. Now, as you can see here on the right, this is a snippet from the reminiscences, the memoir. And it mentions, as you can see, sit in the hall of the old Huguenot, that's meaning Faneuil Hall, one Elizabeth Blakesley. Talks about her coming from Wilmington, North Carolina, concealing herself on a boat, and having the vessel that she was on, this small, tiny space, being smoked out by her cruel, inhumane master, quite literally trying to make her come up for air. I had this small paragraph, and it's such an inspiring story, but we needed more. So in order to try to unpack the story of Elizabeth Blakely and, identify where she lived, what she had done, we looked to a couple different sources. So Megan, if you could go to the next slide, please. So having that point of Wilmington, North Carolina. Started really looking around in archives, digitally, of course, libraries in Wilmington, and was actually able to come across a newspaper article from January of 1850, but talking about an escape, as you can see here, a remarkable escape of a slave. And it describes a very similar escape, doesn't name names, but it describes that escape from Wilmington, North Carolina, secreting herself on board a vessel, the vessel being smoked out. And with this source, was able to identify a rough timeline, figuring out that Elizabeth Blakely, who, according to other sources, which I'll get into in a second, likely escaped when she was about 14 or 15 years old. That she snuck on board a ship inside Wilmington Harbor, unbeknownst to her enslaver, a man named George Davis. And as the account here, as well as the narrative with Austin Beer speaks to, when she's on board that vessel, she's inside a small, tiny, cramped space. And George Davis quite literally smoked out the vessel with tobacco and sulfur to try to make her come up for air. But she did not do it. Now, the next story where Elizabeth Blakely appeared, and Megan, if you go to the next slide, please, was in the records of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. So, looking into their transcriptions of meetings, was able to come across here in the 18th annual meeting, Betsy Blakely, as you can see, as she was referred to here, and that is definitely something that trips up a lot of the research here, because her name is spelled so many different ways. So really, when doing searches for Elizabeth Blakely, Betsy Blakesley, going to try a bunch of different things to really find, a small article or something that, looking for here. But in this anti-slavery meeting, Elizabeth Blakely has just arrived in Boston. She escaped. It took, by some accounts, 4 weeks for her to arrive, but she made it, and she was free. And at this anti-slavery meeting at Faneuil Hall, according to newspaper accounts, as well as the anti-slavery records from the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, she was there. She was on stage. And as the Liberator put it, Lucy Stone, who was a leading anti-slavery activist, brought Blakely onto the stage. Stone came forward, took the slave girl by the hand, welcomed her to our midst, and appealed to the audience against that union and constitution which had subjugated her young sister to such awful suffering and violence. By all accounts, Blakely being on that stage brought that group to tears. But after this, she doesn't really appear much in newspaper accounts. Don't really have any records, letters she would have written, journals, etc. So in order to figure out where she went after this meeting, went to look at various census records, as well as the Vigilance Committee records. So Megan, if you could go to the next slide, please. So looking through census records, was able to determine that she married a man named William Hudson. William Hudson worked as a bricklayer and did other work. So the first record that you see is actually a marriage certificate for Elizabeth Blakely and William Hudson. Now, Blakely, by all accounts, lived in Boston during the beginning of the 1850s, but would leave Boston and go north to Canada. And that you can see here in that middle record from the Vigilance Committee. William C. Nell for Betsy Blakely to Canada. Looking around at census records in Canada and in Toronto and doing research into African-American communities there, was able to identify that she likely lived in Toronto's 8th Ward. You can see here in that very bottom record that is a census record from Toronto with William Hudson and the beginnings of her young family. So sometimes when doing this research, it's digging through a lot of census records. It's kind of, you know, not being able to find a lot of information, finding a lot of dead ends, but every once in a while, you also can get kind of lucky. And Megan, if you could go to the next slide, please. So what you're looking at here is an image of the interior of Faneuil Hall, as well as the opening page to a pamphlet for a celebration at Faneuil Hall of the 100th anniversary of William Lloyd Garrison's birth. And at this meeting, within the records and accounts of the meeting, I was looking into this and actually was looking for something else, and came across the fact that she attended this meeting. And it mentions her by name. It says that Betsy Blakely, who had that daring escape, made it safely in 50 years, 56 years actually, after she was on that stage at Faneuil Hall, having just recently escaped enslavement. She was back there in 1906. And by 1906, she was back not only in Boston to visit this ceremony, but actually living, not in Boston, but close by in Chelsea, Massachusetts. We were able to determine this through census records, but also able to determine this, Megan, if you go to the next slide, please, through her death certificate. One of my colleagues was able to find this for me, and the death certificate, you look at it and it threw me off a little bit, because, you know, it says Elizabeth Hudson, which was her name. It says her mother's maiden name, Betsy Blakely, right? But one of the ways was able to corroborate this and confirm that, you know, the informant, Anna Hudson, who would have been Elizabeth Blakely's daughter, not only was able to confirm that through census records, but also, Megan, if you could go to the next slide, a newspaper account. And interestingly enough, it doesn't really have much to do with Elizabeth Blakely. This was after Elizabeth Blakely's death. But as you can see by the newspaper, famous slave's daughter sues. Anna Hudson was looking to sue to receive damages for services that she did and was not paid for. And the newspaper happened to mention her mother, which corroborated, again, some of the sources and some of the story. So Elizabeth Blakely is confirmed by that certificate, is buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in Everett with her husband. Megan, if you could go to the next slide, please. Unfortunately, she is buried in an unmarked grave, but records do indicate that she was buried in that cemetery. And there is so much of her story that we do not know. We do not have that narrative that would be so valuable. We do not have a lot of her own words. But through finding these little pieces, searching in different areas, different places, different archives, we are able to trace her journey. Megan, if you could go to the next slide, please. This is an image, a sketch of Elizabeth Blakely on board that ship. It's a sketch that was done in a 1930s book called The Brownie Book, which was done by W.E.B. Du Bois, and it was essentially a children's magazine that was a spinoff of The Crisis, which was his magazine. And Elizabeth Blakely, who lived into her 80s, died in 1919. You know, I think she is a great example of a lot of the stories and of a lot of the people that we are talking about and want to elevate. During that journey, when she escaped enslavement, she talked about how, in her mind, when she was in that small space, where, again, cruel, inhumane master was smoking up the vessel, quite literally trying to make her come up for air. In her mind, she had two choices: liberty or death. Blakely and countless others, through the Underground Railroad, through these stories, they truly risked everything in order to seize their freedom. And Megan, if you could go to the next slide, please. If you're interested in visiting some of these sites, in addition to the work that we've done with the Underground Railroad map, we actually just recently debuted a new Underground Railroad audio tour, which is a walking tour that goes from the north slope of Beacon Hill down to the waterfront. This tour is free. It's available through the National Park Service app, which you can download. And you just have to go to Boston African American National Historic Site and choose the Underground Railroad option in self-guided tours. So with that, we will stop sharing the screen, and we are more than happy to take questions. And I have some that have come from the chat, and I will facilitate the Q&A section. So hang on one second, folks. Let me just pull that up. Okay. So starting off, and again, folks, feel free if you do have any additional questions. We got about 10 minutes for them, so feel free to drop them in the chat. So I will throw this out. First off, let's see, we did have a couple that came beforehand. So what were the usual routes to get to Boston from the south? And I know that Ryan touched upon this a little bit, but I can take this one and elaborate. Many people who were coming to Boston that came directly from the south would have done so as stowaways on ships. You know, the Atlantic Ocean, East Coast at the time, that's your 19th century highway. And if you're in a place like Norfolk, Virginia, which is about 550 miles from Boston, you know, if you're walking, you're not going to get here quickly. But if you get on board of a boat, good weather, 4 days, you'd be in Boston in the 19th century. So those networks, those coastal cities, they offered a lot of opportunities, information sharing, and it was a lot of people coming and going, moving parts, offered opportunities for people to escape. So let's see, we'll go next. Ryan, I'm going to throw this one to you. Have any of Shadrach Minkin's relatives been found or identified living in Montreal or any parts of Canada? And if you don't know, that's totally fine, because I'm not sure myself.
All I would know is I'd point that person that asked that question to this book called From Fugitive Slave to Citizen, The Story of Shadrach Minkins by Gary Collison. I read it years ago, but I do think he references some descendants in that. I just can't confirm it right this second. But there is an entire book on Shadrach that follows his life from Norfolk to his death up in Montreal. So I would check that.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. So, and I'll throw this out to both Megan and Ryan here. So what are some suggestions for books that are, you know, going to be best to inform what we've been talking about for Boston and for the Underground Railroad in general?
Hear you.
I can go ahead and say one book which I have on my desk is More Than Freedom by Stephen Kantrowitz, and so I think that is a great resource for learning about some of these stories. And I don't know, Ryan, you have another book or two to add?
Yeah, Black Bostonians, that originally came out in, I think, 1979 by Jim and Lois Horton, is a good place as well to go to. And then there's also stories, there's also full-length books of individual cases. So there's several books I'm aware of. I mentioned the one on Shadrach, but there are several books on Anthony Burns that will give you, you know, really detailed, you know, thorough book length treatment there. And let me think real quickly. There is a book about Lewis Hayden. It's geared towards younger readers, but there is a book, a biography on Hayden. And then the other thing that's always good if you have access to like online, like digital newspaper archives, you can just even word search fugitive or slave in Boston papers from the 1850s. You can come up with a lot of different articles, which is part of the way we did our research.
Great, thank you. I get a lot of questions about New Bedford, which is great. New Bedford definitely had a lot of connections to Boston, especially with anti-slavery circles. One I would recommend, because I know that none of us here are experts on New Bedford and don't want to, speak out of turn on it. I would recommend actually looking up the book Fugitives Gibraltar, which is a book that's solely focused on New Bedford, Underground Railroad activity, and is a great resource for exploring the history of the Underground Railroad in New Bedford. So another question is, where did the slave catchers tend to come from? Were they Northerners or were they from the South? Both.
Yeah, with a couple of the big cases that we've mentioned, it always starts with that, enslaver down south sending either a local law enforcement or a local bounty hunter that they choose to come up north to Boston. And then from there, work with either the local police or primarily the U.S. Marshals, the local U.S. Marshals up here. So it was a combo of both, but the process was initiated, from my understanding, from the enslaver themselves, sending a local representative north to then work with law enforcement up here. I don't know if you have anything to add, Sean. So
No, that's perfect. So got another question about how many people escaped on the Underground Railroad, which is always kind of a hard question to answer just because it was an illegal activity. So we don't know exactly how many people, but historians have estimated as high as 100,000 people escaping on the Underground Railroad, although a lot of historians think that number might be a little too high. And I'd say that the number is probably somewhere between 25,000 people to 40 to 50,000 people escaping on the Underground Railroad. And again, that's strictly estimating. That is by no way, shape, or form kind of hard data. Let's see. Some questions definitely coming into the chat quickly, which is great. Is there any documentation on allies in the South that guided folks to ships or carriages that could transport them to the North, or were enslaved folks on their own? Were there groups such as Quakers who helped at that end? So I can speak a little bit to guiding folks to ships and carriages. So again, kind of going back to those maritime communities, it's a very fluid community, again, with people kind of coming and going. And we have seen through narratives and, other primary source evidence that suggests that people that were enslaved working in cities and ports, would be aware of ships coming and going and be able to trade that information. Free sailors sometimes could come on board shore and might be able to share that information of a sympathetic ship captain or that sympathetic crew. And in fact, this was such a worry that in some ports, like for example, in Charleston, South Carolina, if a ship came into port and had free people of color on board, those free people of color would have to spend the entire ship's duration in port in jail. To try to prevent that spreading of information. So, I think that there would have been definitely plenty of allies that did this. But if you're also looking at individual stories, often in enslaved people, you think the Underground Railroad, it's not necessarily this hard organized network, especially in the South. For enslaved people that are escaping and trying to get over, a border or into free states, often they would have been on their own up until getting to that point. for kind of helping with carriages, there is one example that Ryan was talking about with Lewis Hayden, where he was assisted by two white abolitionists named Calvin Fairbank and Delia Webster, who were able to get Lewis Hayden, his wife Harriet, and her young son Joseph over to the Ohio River via a evening carriage ride. So it appears that there were many women who were involved. And was this the norm for Boston at the time period? And I'll throw that to either of you.
It seems to be. There was certainly a lot of women listed in the Vigilance Committee that, you know, that ran boarding houses that took people in. I mean, that's my number one source I'll point to. And, you know, I would, you know, recommend that video series that's on the Digital Hub for more of those stories.
Well, and as Ryan mentioned, there was the welcoming committees of Black women who were looking to see if anyone was hiding on ships. And also there was the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society, which has some connections to the Underground Railroad as well.
Great. So I had a couple questions about Canada, and can wrap up here with that as we are at 7 o'clock. Canada, you know, was a destination for many people who were escaping enslavement, especially after that 1850 fugitive slave law, because Canada was under the control of, you know, Great Britain at the time, who had already abolished slavery. And therefore, you know, if a freedom seeker made it north, they were in a free country, and Canada was not extraditing freedom seekers. So that really became a destination especially after that 1850 fugitive slave law. You know, there were estimates in Boston of 100 people from that free African-American community of roughly 2,200, you know, leaving the city in a couple months after the 1850 fugitive slave law. Churches losing, like, you know, some up to 85 members. So it very much, you know, became the safe, you know, nothing was entirely safe, but the safest destination. All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming and attending. You know, as Ryan said, want to thank the Boston Public Library for hosting, as always. And Karen, I'm happy to turn it back over to you to close us out.
All righty. Oh, I clearly moved my computer a bit. Thank you so much, everyone. You guys are absolutely epic, as always. I always learn so many things. Megan, Ryan, Sean, I love this program so much. I know I'm not supposed to have a favorite. Clearly my fave. So I really appreciate all the work you put into this. And everyone, thank you so much for joining us on a Wednesday evening. Our next one will be March 1st. When it is about forestry. I guess I just had it in here. Wow, all of your wonderful questions have really, it is Face to Face with Nature Itself, Forest Festivals, and the 19th Century Fight for Climate Justice, which is going to be really interesting and fun. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.